Hello, and welcome back to Counseling Corner, brought to you by UC Davis Student Health and Counseling Services. Each episode, we will address a new mental health and wellness topic, particularly related to the pandemic and hopefully also useful for everyday life. I'm Dr. Karen Miller, and this week we are discussing grief and loss in the wake of the pandemic. Today, I am joined by Dr. Savardi Saib from Purdue University. Dr. Savardi Saib's research team has developed the gains loss framework as a way of conceptualizing the unique impact of specific life events. They argue that the impact can be assessed through determining the losses and gains that each person attributes to any specific life event. With this in mind, each person will have a unique reaction to the current pandemic. The more losses that each person perceives, the higher level of grief that person will experience. Grief is not only connected with death losses, it is a multidimensional response: emotional, cognitive, physiological, social, spiritual, to all types of losses. Losses that people may be experiencing in the face of the pandemic are wide ranging and may include a loss of community, established physical workspace, routine, structure, productivity, and freedom of movement, and even more tangible losses such as income, access to resources, and planned activities or celebrations. The losses are real, and the grief is real. Dr. Sarvati Saib's hope is that we can all find the gains as well as perhaps flexibility, more time with family, opportunities for reflection, and greater appreciation for life. I'd like to thank Dr. Savati Saib for joining us today. And I wonder, what are the conversations that you and your team are having around grief and loss in the wake of the pandemic?
We really are having a lot of conversations. I mean, it's a
Mm.
significant topic. Of course, it's where we all are. That's where we're
Mhm.
spending most of, I think, our mental kind of energy these days. And I think what's particularly powerful about the pandemic, a few things. I mean, one of which is that the death losses will be just so catastrophic, and they already
Right.
are. And
Mhm.
we don't know when those death losses here within the United States will begin to decrease. We haven't
Mhm.
seen that yet. And the idea of that unknown around these unfolding death losses is just
Mhm.
such a tremendous weight and just so challenging. And then on
Absolutely.
top of all of that, we have all of these non death losses that we're in a shared space with, which is
Mhm.
rather odd in a way. Like we're all
Yeah.
facing the pandemic. And yet, as you said, and as we consider things in a complex way, we all still will have a unique kind of profile of the
Mm.
losses and gains that we most connect to this experience. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I am struck by the collectiveness of this
Yes.
grief right now, and
Mhm.
just how, yeah, we are all in this shared space together, and that
Mhm.
the losses are so layered.
Yeah.
One of the other losses, you talk about celebrations of life or celebrations, and I'm thinking of funerals right now. People
Yeah.
who are losing people to COVID-19 or other means are not even able to put their loved ones to rest, and
Right,
how.
absolutely. And at a macro level, right, we have
Mhm.
funeral homes and hospitals that are overwhelmed with
Right.
individuals who have died, particularly in certain areas of the country like New York. Um,
Yeah.
and and then we have, as you say, that individual overlay of what does it mean for my loved one's body?
Right.
Where is their body? How is it being honored and
Mhm.
respected and handled? And will I have an opportunity to see the body? Will I not have an opportunity? And how does that factor into how I uh, conceptualize the death, how I
Yeah.
consider moving forward in my grieving process, not
Mhm.
having that opportunity to perhaps see the person's body.
Right.
And we do know, I mean, the research is, seeing the body is important in some cultures and
Mhm.
less important in others, perhaps. But
Right.
for many, it's a key aspect of the ritual. Bodies are
Right.
involved very closely with ritual and memorialization and honoring
Yes.
of the person's life. Mhm.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that the cross-cultural, considerations, because as you were talking, I was thinking about that in certain cultures, the way the body is even touched and held and taken care of is very
Yes.
important, and,
Yeah.
I imagine that those kind of, ceremonies are not, being upheld right now, and just how hard that is to hold for many
Hmm.
people.
Agreed. I think about
Yeah,
that too. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah.
And, more in the topic of, because I think that, theoretically, we can all kind of think about the death losses, and grieve collectively as a nation, as a world right now. And yet, I think we're all experiencing more of the non-death losses.
Yeah.
So,
Hmm.
talk me through maybe some of the
Yeah.
conversations that you're having around that.
Yeah. I think one of the main conversations around that is that it's not often maybe that people conceptualize what they're experiencing in this way.
Hmm.
I mean, I
Of course.
definitely believe it can be helpful to people because what's happening now is so overwhelming. And
Hmm.
people can conceptualize that in a way that pathologizes their response, that somehow, you know, encourages them to consider that they're not coping appropriately or they're not coping well. And there are absolutely challenges. And oftentimes people with pre-existing, conditions, mental health conditions, this is going to add,
Yeah.
layers that can be very challenging for them. But we
Hmm.
also have people who are overwhelmed right now because the situation is overwhelming. The losses are overwhelming. And I think when we are able to uh, identify and recognize the layers of loss, we
Hmm.
can make so much better sense of the depth of our responses. If we can lay them all out rather than being a burden or adding on burden, it can actually be a sense of relief to be able to see in reality all the aspects that have been lost, we hope temporarily, and the grief that goes along with those losses. I think, in a very related sort of way, within US society, we define grief way too narrowly. I mean,
Mm.
when we think about grief, we believe that grief is equal to sadness, equal to crying. And that's just not the case.
Mhm.
Grief is very complicated, very multidimensional, and I think therefore it's challenging for people to conceptualize what they're experiencing as grief when really it is. You know,
Right.
you're irritable, you can't really focus, you
Mhm.
have physiological symptoms, not just because you're not exercising, but I
Right.
mean the stress adds to the mind body sort of connection in terms of how we cope.
Right.
There's just a lot there. And I think the recognition of the breadth of the losses, the recognition of the breadth of reactions can be very normalizing and very helpful
Yes.
for people. I mean, there's
Yes.
something very enfranchising about that experience rather than disenfranchising of that experience of loss. If we don't see it as loss and recognize it as loss, we won't honor our own reactions as appropriate, which
Yeah.
they are if we think about all the levels. I think another really important aspect of it, so some of that then involves recognition, it involves patience and kindness,
Mhm.
uh, which I often talk about in death related grief, but is absolutely a
Yes.
part of non death loss related grief. You know, uh, Another part of that, though, is that we all will perceive different losses and
Right.
we will all grieve in different ways. And so then there's the necessity for patience and kindness with others
Others.
who are likely grieving in different ways than we are in the midst of this pandemic.
Yes.
So there's that sort of higher process level of recognizing the differences and maybe even being able to articulate those at times
Yeah.
and say, okay, I'm just having a really difficult loss day
Right.
today, and maybe tomorrow I'll be doing better with the losses, but today I'm having a really tough one. And people
Yeah.
will vary within families, significant relationships. There won't be the same sort of level. And so I think
Absolutely.
that's really important. I do think too, um, that if we are open to perceiving potential gains, that
Right.
doesn't minimize or discount the losses that we're experiencing.
Yeah.
That there are moments where we might be able to recognize an interaction or an experience that just
Mhm.
would not have happened if we weren't in the place of physical distancing that we are in right now.
Yeah.
I think it can be a time of reflection, but I say
Mhm.
that, in a privileged way, because there are
Right.
people who are also not at a point where, they can think about their priorities and reevaluate life when there are so many difficulties in that basic level of
Right.
access to resources and
Mhm.
um, food security, shelter security, and
Right.
those kinds of issues as well.
Yeah.
So, then a potential gain is to consider, if we do have resources, what are the ways that we can be helpers? What are
Yes.
the ways that we can be engaged if we have that potential to have a resource, whether it's a personal, a financial resource that we can contribute to those
Mhm.
who are struggling with those very, very basic needs and losses that are also very much a part of this pandemic. The other potential here, and it sounds trite as I say it, but is for communities to step up, right?
Yeah.
For communities to
Absolutely.
be engaged and to be more connected.
Mhm.
And I know within our own town here, we have an organization called Food Finders, and
Mhm.
they're getting additional donations than they usually get, of course, in the midst of
Yeah.
this pandemic. And the National Guard has now become their staff.
Oh,
So the
that's
National Guard
wonderful.
has stepped up, and rather than taking the usual volunteers, it's been the National Guard who has made that decision, potentially to
That's
put themselves at risk, right? To be out
right.
in the public in a way that we're being told now we need
Mhm.
to avoid.
Right.
And that's encouraging. I think
Yeah.
we have people who are giving blood. I mean, that we're not supposed to be out and about and doing that, but I know that is also a situation that we're in right now, which with very low blood supplies.
Yes.
Yeah, another potential opportunity if possible.
Right. So, encouraging people to appropriately, maybe safely do the things that you can do to help in your community right now. And that might even add to the sense of gains at this point, right?
I
And
think it
how
really
we can,
could. Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah,
also, part of what we're dealing with as well is just this general, a huge loss is a loss of control.
absolutely.
I
Yeah.
mean, we don't have control. So then
None.
the other part of that is, what do we do with that? How do we,
Right.
even if we think about the loss of structure and the loss of
Mhm.
productivity, what are the things we do have control over within whatever setting we're sheltered in, to
Right.
be able to make choices, to be able to establish schedules, if that makes a difference for us and gives us
Yeah.
back a sense of control. And then also, that's really what the giving back, I think, is about, is what
Mhm.
can I do? How can I act when there are
Mhm.
so many ways that I cannot act to do good or to be helpful?
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's definitely, one of the things that I talked about in the last video was,
Mhm.
the radical acceptance, right? That's something that we can put in place into our lives right now because there is so much that we can't control and that reality
Mhm.
is just what it is,
That's right.
which is a
That's right.
really hard place to come to, and kind of a necessary place to come to stop the fight, right, of what can I do, what can I do, because right now really all we
Yeah.
can do is kind of take care of ourselves and our homes, and um, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. I hope it is an opportunity for us to be connected,
Hmm.
more in a general kind of way,
Yeah.
to be more open to giving and more open to receiving in a situation where that's so required right now.
Hmm.
We have to be supporting one another in the midst of such you know,
Right.
dire life situation here.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
as we know, grief is not a moment in time necessarily, right? It
Hmm.
fluctuates, and future griefs can kind of trigger these reactions. And so
Hmm.
even when we move
Yeah.
past this and move through it, in terms of the restrictions we're under right now, um, we will still feel this. This is part of our history now. This is part of our lived experience. And so to continue to be gentle with ourselves moving forward.
Absolutely. And that whole mode of sense making, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
idea that we do live in story, and this is a very tough chapter here.
Yeah. Yes.
And that we want and need this chapter to eventually end, and
Mm-hmm.
yet it will color the chapters of the future. So
Yes. Yeah.
definitely.
It's really lovely. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Heather.
Mhm.
I really appreciate our conversation, and I think the students at UC Davis will really benefit from this information, and just to be able to hold that that's what they're feeling right now. That I'm grieving. I've there's so much that I've lost, and how can I make sense of this in a way that can capitalize on some of the gains and to help me kind of move through this in a way that can be meaningful and also growth making. Right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
If you're interested in learning more about Dr. Savati Saib's team and their work, they can be found at griefandlossrt.wordpress.com. I've also included other resources to help you navigate your own grief and loss during this time. Until we talk again, this is Dr. Karen Miller wishing you hope, health, and happiness. Stay Aggie strong.